This seems to be typically what occurs when white avoids mainline queen's pawn openings, and this would be a very interesting setup for me. Just going to the Nimza Indian, a defense I am trying to learn more about, but they avoid it these days. They could have played knight f3 as well, and I again want positions that I'm more accustomed to, so I would play d5 for the solid option and c5 if I needed to play something that's more like a Benoni or some strange variation of a Benoni, perhaps where you delay e6 advance and make it look like a Sicilian dragon pawn structure for a long time. But by playing d5 I'm trying to play very solidly. But I think this is typically what they want if you're going to play this type of setup. I think typically they really would like when you play for the more classical arrangement. Bishop f4. Already looking at the c7 square. Typical ways of playing it is e6, knight b5, bishop d6, or stopping it by going slowly, and then c5. This is also a good way, playing it almost like a kind of tarrasch, so you should be active in this line, but I'm trying to avoid anything like this. I'm not sure what the opponent has prepared or not, and I feel more comfortable playing bishop f5 before moving the pawn. And you must be careful, sometimes you can get your bishop trapped in some variations. c6, completely stopping this, even though e6 is more normal, where you can obviously play knight a6 or bishop d6. Going with this c6 move, I'm trying to avoid knight b5, even though it's a little bit more passive than continuing with something like c5. But you have to make do with what you're prepared to allow. Knight e5 I was not expecting. I think it's the fourth or something. Most common move on the lead chess database. However, it's fine. h6 opening a square for the bishop to hide away in, which was not very relevant in a few moves. However, the position is still very equal or satisfactory for the black side. White really has to work to prove an advantage, of course, but black also has to prove an advantage in certain of these positions, so things like e6 might be more required. a6 is even possible, I think. e3 gets played, knight e4 trying to exchange pieces, perhaps looking for something like f6, chasing away the knight, supporting e5 or playing e6, f6, but you have to be careful. Nothing special has happened, but white has the better development. I moved my bishop all the way back, and this is something you see in the Caro-Kann sometimes. And then just bishop d3, allowing white's quick development. And I think this is the whole point of why playing for anything like knight f6 d5 may be problematic for black from a psychological perspective and a practical perspective, because you're not really even developed and your opponent already can decide. And as you can see from these pawn advances, white is almost ready for almost classical direct pawn thrust, and black can barely do anything. But there's many resources. Knight e7, castles, e6. Somehow all of these moves are theory. I'm not sure exactly what the big difference would be between bishop g3 and some other move. I'm not going to allow him to play f4 anyway, but in case he wants to play f4, you do exchange, no matter what his point is. But now you play f6. So either f4 would have been played, or this bishop e5. I'm not allowing any of these pieces to stay there. Queen g6 check, still theory. King d7 is, I'm not sure if it's a new move by me, but king e7 is apparently most common, but it doesn't make sense for me to hem in my bishop. And trying to exchange the queens, and it would just be an equal endgame without any pawns exchanged already. Quite strange. Queen d3, now of course logical conclusion of playing the king to the center would be to play also bishop d6 and allowing for something like this, and still somehow white does not have enough resources to actually win the game or even have any advantage, and must be careful because moves like c4 might just be weakening his position too much, and black is actually able to avoid all of the trouble. But e4 happens, just moving the king outside. An important moment, do you play c takes or c takes h5, and then you have these kind of variations, or white slowly builds up? Or do you play e takes, which is probably also fine, this is just very passive. And I think one of the inspirations for me to play in this kind of way with f6 is a game I played blindfolded many years ago, and you're basically saying I don't have to castle my king. It's perfectly safe and advantageous to have the king so close to the center when there's almost no pieces left. It looks scary, but really there's nothing you can do. I'm not sure if I played it myself, you know, as a novelty, but I know that when I played it, it was new for me to come up with the f6 system of a blitz game on the internet. Was it chess.com? I don't know. Too long ago. Either way. Rook f1, rook fe1, queen d7, nothing special is happening here. Black just defends some basic threats. You attack, you try to be active, I guess, but there's really nothing, and this is a liability almost. I think it's the reason I lose the game, actually. The bishop should have been exchanged, I believe, already here, and there would be nothing special going on. But for some reason I wasn't adventurous enough to go for this type of setup. But as you can see, rook has been exchanged, you exchange the pawns in the center, nothing special, but you're losing. After queen b3, a double attack, and you would like your queen on d6, but it's not possible. You would like a check, but it's not possible. You would like queen e6, but you lose b4. So at the end of the day, you just lost. And it's not just a pawn, you know, this is serious. There's basically nothing left in this position. And because of the light squares being so weak, it's just very quick to lose. And you can't really go anywhere. For example, okay, king g6, queen check. With such strong center pawns, I mean, I don't see how black defends anything or gets any counterplay. You would want the king on one of these squares at least, but that's not gonna happen. You just cut off. Now this is the key point of this whole variation, is after the rook captures, you must capture with the king. And then the exchange is no problem. Queen check, you move, queen check. You have an option, I guess, but it's probably just fine to go to f7 again. Maybe you could evaluate things like king d7, but now also if your queen here, you're looking at a pawn, so white will have to be a little bit passive. And the initiative is possibly going to black, but it's easy enough for white to play. So unfortunately, you lose just too easily. However, you know, it's difficult to say how these types of improving moves have to be made, because I was not sure about this whole setup. So many different systems that you have to analyze in these unconventional queen's pawn openings. But it's a really elementary mistake to miss this. And I'm really not sure how I missed it. Maybe I played it too quickly as well. Not taking too serious the differences, the very subtle difference. But yeah, these moves. And then, I mean, I think the last moment you'll have something like this, and after d6, exchange. Obviously a setup like this isn't necessarily the best for white, but I'm just saying it's definitely not supposed to happen at all. But of course none of this is forced. That's the big problem. It doesn't have to capture, it doesn't have to move his pawn, but you can imagine again the move queen b3, threatening this, threatening infiltrating. He keeps these occupied, so you check, and there's nothing to do. Capture the pawn, and you lose all your pawns. Obviously this is alternative. Capture here, you lose all your pawns, so it's very difficult to know why I didn't just analyze for a few moves longer, you know. Ask myself what my opponent's threat is. However, I was happy actually that until this move it was basically over 90% accuracy for both players. I was surprised to find out that so many of these moves were actually played before, a couple dozen times, even going so far of the king advance to the center. But I should have gone for bishop d6. No matter the result of the game, I should have just gone for bishop d6 and played on that theme of occupying the center so far as possible without causing too much of a problem. But then I have to look at king e7 as well. Bishop moves. You possibly have the same kind of thing going on here. I'm not sure about king d7, but let's say king f7, and the game would have to continue in some way. Quite a few moves to consider to transpose into those other lines, but king d7 again would allow this bishop d6 idea, I imagine. So sometimes you can still get interesting positions even in these unconventional setups. Even in these very dull looking London systems. But you have to be careful because black can obviously lose very easily. And I just hope to play more of these types of games where it's possible to imaginatively centralize your king in literally a middle game. But it's also quite weird, isn't it, where it's a middle game but none of the pawns have been exchanged. I mean, maybe that's why it's okay for me to move to the center, because there's no open lines. Like you can imagine if, I don't know, make some silly moves. These pawns gets exchanged and there's a rook AC supported by this bishop. Then they would be doubling. So maybe that's why it's allowable to keep the king on this d7 square, or even d6 if the bishops are exchanged.